Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are transporting you back to one of the most defining and frankly freezing depths of the Cold War.
Yeah, we're heading straight into the tense, divided streets of Berlin in the summer of 1963.
Exactly. And if you're tuning in, you probably appreciate when the grand sweep of history takes an unexpected, almost absurd turn.
Because today we're unpacking one of the strangest historical paradoxes of the 20th century.
We really are. We're looking at a moment of sheer geopolitical brinkmanship, a speech that genuinely shook the foundations of the global world order.
Right.
And yet, this monumental rhetorical masterpiece has become permanently, inextricably entangled with a rumor about, of all things, a jelly-filled donut.
It remains one of the most remarkably persistent historical myths in the modern era, honestly. But before we even touch on the pastry aspect, establishing the sheer gravity of the historical stakes is absolutely crucial here.
Right, because we aren't just looking at a dry recitation of a presidential itinerary today.
No, not at all. This is a forensic examination of how high-wire international diplomacy, the idiosyncratic quirks of cross-cultural linguistics, and really the relentless machinery of pop culture can completely rewrite our collective memory.
And we are drawing from a massive stack of source material for this. We've got architectural records from divided Berlin, recently declassified archival documents from the Kennedy administration, and comprehensive historical analyses from scholars.
Scholars who have spent entire careers untangling the actual events of that day from the urban legend that just swallowed it whole.
Exactly. So our mission today is to put you right there in the crowd in West Berlin. We're going to trace the incredibly fraught, chaotic genesis of President John F. Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner speech.
We'll analyze the dramatic, highly improvised delivery of those words on the steps of the Rathaus Schöneberg.
And then we are going to systematically dismantle the bizarre viral lie that managed to overshadow the true history for decades.
To truly grasp the weight of Kennedy's words, though, you really have to feel the absolute pressure cooker that was West Berlin in the early 1960s.
You do. So let's look at the geographical nightmare that the post-World War II Allied agreements created. When the country of Germany was carved up into occupation zones by the victorious powers, the capital city Berlin was treated as a special case.
Right, but its location was the ultimate geopolitical trap. It wasn't sitting safely on the border between the newly formed East and West Germany.
No, it was situated roughly 100 miles deep inside Soviet-controlled territory.
Which created a scenario that was entirely unprecedented in modern statecraft. I mean, the city of Berlin itself was subdivided into 4 sectors administered by the US, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union.
Right.
This meant that the 3 western sectors, what became known as West Berlin, formed a functional exclave.
It was this thriving island of Western capitalist democracy that was completely and entirely surrounded by a sea of Soviet-backed East German totalitarian control.
The sheer logistics of maintaining this city were staggering. Every single piece of coal, every loaf of bread, every medical supply had to be transported through highly regulated transit corridors, highways, railways, air corridors that cut directly through hostile territory.
And the vulnerability of those supply lines was tested almost immediately.
Oh, yeah. The Soviets realized very quickly that they had a massive pressure point.
In 1948, they simply severed those land and water transit routes. That initiated the Berlin blockade in an attempt to just starve the Western Allies out of the city entirely.
And the response to that, of course, was the Berlin airlift. The U.S. and British air forces flew millions of tons of supplies into the city around the clock for nearly a year.
Which is just a monumental logistical feat.
Right.
And it transformed West Berlin in the eyes of the world. It stopped being just a conquered enemy capital and became the ultimate global symbol of resistance against Soviet expansion.
That transformation is key because it established an incredible psychological bond between the citizens of West Berlin and the United States.
But while West Berlin became this shining symbol for the West, it simultaneously became a practical, existential nightmare for the East German government.
Right. By 1952, the broader inner German border, the massive frontier separating the entire country of East Germany from West Germany, was sealed shut.
The East German authorities fortified it with fences, alarms, and guards with shoot-to-kill orders.
Everywhere, that is, except for the city limits of Berlin.
Because the entire city of Berlin was still technically under the joint administration of the Four-Power Agreement, the local sector borders within the city had to remain relatively porous.
You could live in the Soviet sector of East Berlin and just take the subway to work in the American sector of West Berlin.
It created the single largest, most glaring loophole in the entire Iron Curtain.
And the East German populace took full advantage of that loophole. If you were an East German citizen disillusioned with the failing socialist economy or the oppressive Stasi surveillance, you simply traveled to East Berlin, walked across the street, or hopped on an underground train into West Berlin.
And presented yourself at a Western refugee center. From there, you were flown safely over the Soviet zone right into West Germany.
You look at the sheer numbers, and the East German state was literally bleeding to death.
Between the founding of the state in 1949 and the summer of 1961, roughly 3.5 million people packed whatever they could carry and just walked away from the socialist experiment.
Which constituted nearly 20% of their entire population.
Wow. 20%.
And crucially, the crisis wasn't just about the raw volume of people leaving, it was about the demographic makeup of those defectors.
Right, the brain drain.
Exactly. The East German leadership was watching an utterly devastating brain drain. The people fleeing were the doctors, the university professors, the electrical engineers, the young, able-bodied, skilled laborers.
They were losing the exact demographic you need to maintain a functioning industrial society.
Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader, realized that if this hemorrhage wasn't stopped immediately, the state of East Germany would face total economic and societal collapse.
So that desperation culminates in the dead of night on August 13, 1961. The operation is executed with staggering speed. East German troops and police units deploy along the exact demarcation line between East and West Berlin.
They tear up the paving stones on the streets to stop vehicles, and they begin unrolling endless coils of barbed wire.
Families who lived on the same street were suddenly cut off from each other. People who worked in the West were trapped in the East. And the official state propaganda used to justify this brutality was a fascinating piece of Orwellian theater.
Oh, absolutely. The official nomenclature deployed by the East German state was the Antifascist Schutzwall, the Antifascist Protective Barrier.
They really spun it.
They did. The narrative they fed their citizens was that this drastic measure was entirely defensive. They claimed it was urgently required to keep Western spies, saboteurs, and fascist provocateurs from infiltrating their socialist paradise and undermining their economy.
It's an incredible rhetorical flip, considering the universally accepted reality. Everyone, on both sides of the divide, knew it was the Berlin Wall, and its singular, undeniable purpose was to turn East Berlin into a prison to lock its own citizens inside.
Right. And over the coming months, that temporary barbed wire was systematically replaced by massive concrete slabs.
Entire apartment buildings that happened to sit on the borderline were forcibly evacuated. Their windows facing the west were bricked up, and eventually the buildings were demolished entirely to create the death strip.
This was a heavily illuminated, raked sand corridor, complete with anti-vehicle trenches, guard dogs, and watchtowers manned by soldiers armed with machine guns.
The psychological shock to the West Berliners was profound. Their city, which had been a beacon of escape, was suddenly a besieged fortress.
And this placed the administration of President John F. Kennedy in an agonizing geopolitical bind.
The citizens of West Berlin, the mayor Willy Brandt, and many hardliners back in Washington were absolutely screaming for the United States to respond with decisive military force.
They wanted American tanks to roll up to the demarcation line and crush the barbed wire the moment it was laid down.
But Kennedy couldn't do that. The historical sources outline exactly why his hands were tied. Technically, the Soviets and their East German allies were building this barrier entirely on their own sovereign territory within their designated sector.
If Kennedy ordered American tanks to forcefully cross that line and destroy the wall, he would be initiating a direct kinetic military conflict with the Soviet Union.
In the summer of 1961, with tensions already at a fever pitch, that meant risking a global nuclear holocaust over municipal access rights in a city half a world away.
Which is exactly the grim calculus Kennedy had to accept. Just weeks before the wall became a permanent, concrete reality, Kennedy delivered a nationally televised address on July 25, 1961.
In it, he vehemently reaffirmed the United States' absolute commitment to defending West Berlin, stating that any attack on that city would be treated as an attack on the U.S.
He outlined the core non-negotiables: the presence of Western troops, free access to the city, and the self-determination of West Berliners.
But, and this is the vital subtext that historians highlight by specifically emphasizing the defense of West Berlin, he was implicitly conceding that the United States was powerless to intervene in what the Soviets did in East Berlin.
He essentially accepted a massive, highly visible physical defeat. The wall was up, and it was going to stay up.
He couldn't tear it down with military hardware, which meant that as the years progressed, he desperately needed to challenge it with rhetoric. He needed a monumental symbolic victory to reassure the deeply traumatized citizens of West Berlin that the United States had not abandoned them.
That strategic imperative is the true genesis of the 1963 visit. Kennedy is heading to Berlin, needing to deliver a message of unshakable emotional solidarity to a population that feels incredibly isolated and vulnerable, living every single day under the shadow of Soviet artillery.
Knowing those massive geopolitical stakes makes the actual preparation for this speech absolutely fascinating.
It really does.
When we dig into the archival records of how the Ich bin ein Berliner speech was actually written, the origin story isn't born in the tense war rooms of divided Germany. The core rhetorical framework was actually recycled from a completely different event over a year earlier.
It is a brilliant detail of presidential speech writing. The historian Andreas Daum has done incredibly exhaustive work tracing the archival evolution of this speech.
Right.
He points out that the fundamental architectural conceit of the Berlin Address can be found in a speech Kennedy delivered in New Orleans on May 4th, 1962.
Kennedy was speaking at a civic reception, addressing local leaders, and he deploys this specific historical analogy. He uses the Latin phrase, "Cius Romanus sum," I am a Roman citizen.
In that 1962 context, Kennedy was telling the audience, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was to say, I am a citizen of Rome. Today, I believe in 1962, the proudest boast is to say, I am a citizen of the United States.
He was actively drawing a parallel between the ancient, overarching protection and pride afforded by the Roman Empire and the immense burden and honor of American citizenship during the Cold War.
He specifically used that analogy to praise the American soldiers who were stationed in far-flung outposts like West Berlin, standing on the frontier of freedom.
He takes this grand classical concept, equating the modern defensive democracy with the ancient might of Rome, and files it away in his rhetorical toolbox.
Then when the time comes in June 1963 to draft the major address for the Berlin trip, that New Orleans blueprint is pulled out and dusted off.
But the actual drafting process at the White House was far from a solitary genius writing by candlelight. It was incredibly collaborative, iterative, and, according to the sources, a bit chaotic.
The drafting involved some of the heaviest hitters of his administration, including his trusted counsel and primary speechwriter Ted Sorensen, and advisors like Arthur Schlesinger.
The records show that a full week before the trip, they had already compiled a typed memorandum of potential expressions they wanted the president to deploy. Right there on that preliminary list are the English phrases, I am a Berliner, and I'm proud to be in Berlin, alongside early attempts at phonetic German transcriptions.
Which introduces one of the most humanizing, relatable elements of this entire historical deep dive.
Oh, absolutely.
John F. Kennedy, the commander-in-chief, a man renowned for his silver-tongued oratory in English, was notoriously, hopelessly terrible at foreign languages.
He simply did not have an ear for it, a fact that was often highlighted by the stark contrast with his wife, Jackie, who spoke fluent French and Spanish.
The internal memos and accounts of the practice sessions reveal a real struggle. Kennedy was initially presented with drafts that included entire paragraphs of German text.
So he sat down with a dedicated team to practice. Margaret Plishkin, a highly skilled translator for the U.S. State Department, his speechwriter Ted Sorensen, and Robert Lochner, an American interpreter who had actually grown up in Berlin and possessed a flawless local accent.
They ran him through the pronunciation drills, and it quickly became apparent to everyone in the room that if the president attempted to deliver long, complex German sentences, he was highly likely to mangle the pronunciation so badly it would become a diplomatic embarrassment rather than a triumph.
So the team pivoted. They stripped the German down to its absolute bare essentials, focusing entirely on maximizing the impact of a few key repeated phrases.
And the physical artifact we have from this process is incredible. The final typed reading copy of the speech, dated June 25, the day before the event, doesn't actually contain the phonetic transcriptions. Kennedy had to manually add them back in himself.
You can look at the archival photos of his cue card, and right there in the margins, in Kennedy's own handwriting, is his personal cheat code. He writes it out in English orthography. Ich bin ein Berliner.
He literally spells out the word Berliner using B-E-A-R like the animal and Liner at the end, and he adds asterisks around it to make sure it catches his eye.
He even did the same for the Latin phrase, writing it phonetically, using the classical pronunciation as Civis Romanus sum, utilizing a K sound for the C and a W sound for the V.
That handwritten note demonstrates a meticulous dedication to mastering the precise auditory delivery of the line, recognizing that the emotional resonance relied entirely on the crowd understanding those four words perfectly.
But what happens decades later regarding the authorship of those four words is a fascinating study in historical memory and ego. Because the speech became such a monolithic success, multiple people later stepped forward to claim they were the true architect of the phrase.
The competing claims are wild. Let's look at the timeline of people trying to take credit. First, you have the State Department translator Margaret Pastry.
In 1997, decades after the fact, she wrote an account stating that she had been called to the White House specifically to translate the phrase and teach Kennedy how to say it.
She claimed the literal translation had been hastily provided by another stateside translator who was irritated about having his weekend interrupted.
Then you have Ted Sorensen, one of the most famous political wordsmiths of the century. In his 2008 memoir, Sorensen strongly insinuated his central role in crafting the moment.
But significantly, Sorensen claimed that he was the one who made the linguistic choice to insert the word ein into the phrase. He was essentially falling on his sword, taking the blame for what he mistakenly believed was the jelly donut grammatical error, which we will thoroughly debunk shortly.
Sorensen's account was even corroborated at times by the former mayor of West Berlin, Willy Brandt.
And if that wasn't confusing enough, you have the interpreter, Robert Lochner. In his own memoirs, Lochner insisted that the phrase wasn't finalized in Washington at all.
He claimed that Kennedy specifically turned to him right inside Mayor Willy Brandt's office in Berlin on the day of the speech, asked for the German translation of "I am a Berliner," and that they practiced the pronunciation together right there on the spot.
When you have this many conflicting eyewitness accounts from highly credible people, historians have to rely on the paper trail. Andreas Dohm's comprehensive synthesis of the archives definitively cuts through the confusion.
While the various translators obviously provided the literal German vocabulary, the structural DNA of the speech, the comparison to the Roman citizen, was undeniably Kennedy's, originating in New Orleans.
Furthermore, the physical evidence of the June 25th draft proves the phrase was established before they ever landed in Germany, refuting Lochner's timeline.
Ultimately, the synthesis shows that while the vocabulary was sourced from his staff, the physical act of writing the final phonetic cues and the decision to hinge the entire emotional climax of the address on that specific phrase was entirely driven by Kennedy himself.
He knew exactly the weapon he was wielding, so let's move from the strategy sessions to the world stage.
The date is June 26, 1963. Kennedy spent the morning touring the city. He has stood on viewing platforms and physically looked over the concrete, the barbed wire, and the armed guards of the Berlin Wall.
By the time his motorcade arrives at the Rathaus Schöneberg, the atmosphere in the city is electric.
The visual spectacle of that afternoon is hard to overstate. The Rathaus Schöneberg served as the city hall for the West Berlin municipal government. In front of the building is a massive public square.
The historical estimates place the crowd at roughly 120,000 people. You are looking at a vast, tightly packed sea of humanity stretching as far as the eye can see.
These are people who have been living under a state of psychological siege for 2 years.
The steps of the Rathaus are a who's who of Cold War political titans. You have the U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, you have the West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, and Mayor Willy Brandt.
Crucially, you also have Lucius D. Clay, the former military governor who had orchestrated the Berlin airlift 15 years prior, a man who was viewed as an absolute savior by the local population.
The president of the Berlin Parliament, Otto Bach, speaks first, delivering a grim summary of the recent hardships caused by the wall, essentially setting a somber, urgent tone.
And then, John F. Kennedy steps up to the podium. He has the meticulously typed, heavily vetted reading copy of the speech sitting right in front of him.
This is a document that the national security apparatus has spent weeks refining to ensure it strikes the exact right diplomatic balance.
But Kennedy looks out at those 120,000 faces. He has the brutal reality of the concrete wall he saw that morning fresh in his mind, and he makes a momentous decision.
He abandons the safe, sanitized script.
Historians point to this as the exact moment Kennedy's raw political instinct takes over. The visual reality of the wall triggered a visceral anger in him.
He decides that diplomatic caution is inadequate for the moment. He ignores the moderated text recommended by his advisors, pulls out his handwritten phonetic cheat sheet, and begins to improvise.
Adopting a vastly more aggressive, provocative posture than anyone in Washington had authorized.
Right. He guides the massive crowd through the buildup, relying on that New Orleans framework, and delivers the iconic climax.
He says, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis romanus sum. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner.
The crowd roared, and Kennedy kept pushing, building to an incredible crescendo that linked the fate of every democratic citizen to this single besieged city.
He concluded, all free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The delivery is a masterclass in cadence and emotional resonance. But if we analyze the archival audio of the exact moment he first drops the German phrase, the sequence of the crowd's reaction is absolutely vital to understanding how the later myths evolved.
When you listen to the tape, it isn't instantaneous pandemonium. There is a distinct multi-second beat of silence after Kennedy says the German words.
Why? Because standing right next to him on the podium is Heinz Weber, the official translator from the U.S. mission in Berlin.
Kennedy speaks, and the crowd waits patiently for Weber to translate the surrounding English context and then repeat the president's German punchline.
Only after Weber finishes the translation does the crowd truly erupt. The sheer volume of the cheers washing over the square is deafening.
You can see the visible relief wash over Kennedy's face. He had taken a massive linguistic gamble on the world stage, and he knew he had nailed the pronunciation.
In a moment of genuine, unscripted relief, he turns to Heinz Weber and publicly thanks him.
Kennedy jokes into the microphone, saying, I appreciate my interpreter translating my German. Weber, functioning as a consummate professional, dutifully translates the president's self-deprecating joke about his own terrible language skills into German for the crowd.
And that is the exact moment the crowd bursts into sustained laughter. They are laughing with the president at his own charming self-awareness, not at a linguistic blunder.
Kennedy stands there, visibly thrilled, adjusting his suit jacket. As Dowd described it, he was grinning like a schoolboy who had just successfully pulled off a massive coup.
He had captured the heart of the city. But while the crowd was cheering, the mood among his senior staff standing right behind him was rapidly approaching sheer panic.
George Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, was listening to the improvisation with mounting horror.
Bundy's entire job was to manage the geopolitical fallout, and he realizes Kennedy is throwing gasoline on an already raging diplomatic fire.
During the improvisation, Kennedy had practically challenged the Soviet Union to a physical confrontation. He ad-libbed the line, Lasst sie nach Berlin kommen, meaning, let them come to Berlin.
He aimed that specific barb directly at anyone, including allies, who argued that the West should try to negotiate or compromise with the communists.
He was basically shouting to the world, you think we can compromise with these people? Come look at this wall.
Bundy immediately recognized that this level of aggressive rhetoric was going to infuriate the Kremlin and potentially destabilize ongoing, delicate negotiations on other fronts like nuclear test bans.
The moment Kennedy stepped off the podium and into the motorcade, Bundy confronted him. They had a matter of hours before Kennedy was scheduled to deliver a second major address that afternoon at the Freie Universität Berlin.
The ride from the Rathaus to the university turns into a frantic session of political damage control. They tear into the text of the upcoming university speech, furiously crossing out aggressive language and softening the tone.
The speech Kennedy ultimately delivers at the Free University is dramatically different in character. It is highly conciliatory, focusing on academic cooperation, the shared pursuit of knowledge, and carefully walking back the fire and brimstone he had just unleashed at the City Hall.
But the genie was already out of the bottle. If we analyze the geopolitical fallout from the Soviet perspective, their reaction was a mixture of deep confusion and profound anger.
Just 16 days prior to the Berlin speech, on June 10th, Kennedy had delivered what is arguably his most important foreign policy address at American University in Washington. It was titled, A Strategy of Peace.
In that American University speech, Kennedy was remarkably progressive. He called for a re-examination of American attitudes toward the Soviet Union, urging empathy for the devastating losses the Russian people suffered in World War II.
And actively advocating for a path toward mutual understanding to avoid the sheer madness of mutually assured nuclear destruction.
It was a highly diplomatic olive branch. So when the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, hears the American University speech, he thinks he has a partner for de-escalation.
2 weeks later, he watches the same American president stand at the Berlin Wall, rallying a crowd of 120,000 people and aggressively taunting the Soviet bloc with, let them come to Berlin.
Khrushchev was utterly bewildered by the whiplash. Shortly after the Berlin address, Khrushchev publicly scoffed at the erratic messaging, remarking to the international press that one would think the two speeches had been delivered by two different presidents.
The diplomatic waters were certainly muddied, but in terms of historical legacy, the speech at Rathaus Schöneberg was an unmitigated triumph. It permanently cemented Kennedy's image as the ultimate defender of the free world.
In fact, the sheer power of that moment created an inescapable mandatory playbook for every American president that followed him.
It became a geopolitical necessity. If you occupied the Oval Office during or immediately following the Cold War, and you traveled to Europe, a pilgrimage to the Berlin Wall to deliver a soaring symbolic address was a mandatory requirement of the job.
You had to prove you could stand where Kennedy stood.
The echoes of 1963 are deafening when you look at the historical timeline. In 1987, you have Ronald Reagan standing at the Brandenburg Gate, utilizing that exact same strategy of aggressive, highly symbolic rhetoric, demanding, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
And even after the Soviet Union collapsed and the wall was physically dismantled, the template remained. When Bill Clinton visited a reunified Berlin in 1994, he deliberately channeled Kennedy's cadence, delivering the German phrase, "Berlin is free. Berlin is free."
They were all chasing the rhetorical high of that original perfect moment.
And the city of Berlin itself has enshrined that moment in its physical geography. The massive square where the crowd gathered was rapidly renamed John F. Kennedy Platz.
If you visit the Rathaus Schöneberg today, you can see the enormous commemorative plaque mounted on a column at the main entrance, and the room directly above the entrance is permanently dedicated to his visit.
The physical artifacts of the speech are treated with the reverence of sacred relics. The Checkpoint Charlie Museum features the video of the delivery as a centerpiece of their exhibition.
And that single sheet of paper, the heavily annotated, hand-corrected reading copy where Kennedy scrawled his phonetic cheat codes, is preserved in the climate-controlled vaults of the National Archives in the United States.
We have established without a shadow of a doubt that this event was a monumental triumph of Cold War statecraft. It was a soaring, deeply moving assertion of solidarity that fundamentally altered the morale of a besieged city.
So with all of that profound historical weight established, how on earth do we end up talking about a jelly donut?
It is time to dissect the urban legend, because the reality is that for a massive segment of the population, the myth is the only thing they actually associate with the speech.
The famous legend claims that by adding the indefinite article ein, the German word for a, Kennedy committed a catastrophic grammatical error.
The myth asserts that instead of saying, "I am a citizen of Berlin," his inclusion of ein fundamentally altered the meaning of the sentence to, "I am a jelly donut."
And the cherry on top of this myth is the claim that the crowd of 120,000 Germans instantly recognized the pastry gaffe and burst into laughter at the president's expense.
As a piece of historical folklore, it has incredible staying power. It's humorous, it humanizes a powerful figure by deflating his grandest moment, and it perfectly encapsulates the anxieties of trying to speak a foreign language.
But as a factual account of what transpired, it is comprehensively, demonstrably, and unequivocally false. It fails on a grammatical level, it fails on a regional linguistic level, and it fails on the basic timeline of the historical audio.
Let's systematically tear down the pillars of this myth, starting with the German grammar itself. Where does the confusion over the word ein actually come from?
The foundation of the myth rests on a fundamental misunderstanding by English speakers of a specific rule in German syntax.
It is entirely true that in the German language, when you are stating your literal profession or your literal city of origin, you generally omit the indefinite article.
If you were born and raised in Berlin and you want to tell someone where you were from, you simply say, "Ich bin Berliner," the same way a doctor would say, "Ich bin Arzt." You do not use the word a.
So the people who created the myth learned that one specific rule and thought they had caught the president in a mistake.
Precisely. But they ignored the crucial caveat to that rule. The omission of the article ein applies only when the speaker is making a literal statement of fact.
When a speaker is using the noun figuratively, utilizing the indefinite article ein is not only grammatically acceptable, it is absolutely required to convey the correct meaning.
And the context of the speech makes it painfully obvious to every single person in that square that Kennedy was speaking figuratively.
The crowd was fully aware that the President of the United States was a wealthy patrician born in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was not claiming he possessed a local birth certificate.
Exactly. He was utilizing the phrase as a powerful metaphor. He was telling the crowd, I share your democratic values, I recognize your struggle, and in spirit, I stand alongside you.
By deliberately employing the phrase, Ich bin ein Berliner, he was grammatically indicating that he was a Berliner in spirit, not by birth.
If he had actually omitted the ein and said, Ich bin Berliner, it would have sounded incredibly strange, as if he were genuinely confused about his own literal nationality. His grammar was utterly flawless for the figurative metaphor he was executing.
So the grammatical foundation of the myth is completely destroyed. Now let's address the second pillar, the pastry itself. Because even if he had made a grammatical error, the geography of German baked goods completely ruins the joke.
Is a jam-filled donut actually called a Berliner?
The answer is heavily dependent on precisely where you're standing in Germany. Germany has incredibly diverse regional dialects, especially regarding food.
If you walk into a bakery in the north, the west, or the southwest of the country and ask for a jam-filled pastry, they will indeed hand you a Berliner, which is short for Berliner Pfannkuchen.
But where was Kennedy standing?
He was standing in Berlin, and in the city of Berlin, as well as the surrounding region of Brandenburg, the local dialect refers to that specific pastry simply as a Pfannkuchen, which translates literally to pancake.
This is the ultimate geographical irony. If you went into a bakery in West Berlin in 1963 and asked the baker for a Berliner, they wouldn't have the faintest idea why you were asking for a jelly donut.
They would think you were asking to purchase a local citizen. The local audience wouldn't have even made the associative leap between the word Kennedy used and the pastry, because that word was simply not part of their daily culinary vocabulary.
It is the equivalent of a foreign dignitary giving a speech in New York City declaring, I am a Frankfurter, to express solidarity, and a rumor starting decades later that the entire crowd thought the dignitary was calling themselves a hot dog.
The local terminology simply doesn't support the punchline.
And that brings us to the final, fatal blow to the myth, the laughter. The myth relies heavily on the narrative that the crowd instantly laughed at the pastry joke, humiliating the president.
But as we already established when analyzing the audio tapes, the timeline of the laughter completely contradicts the myth.
The archival audio is unambiguous. Kennedy delivers the line. The crowd is silent. Heinz Weber translates it. The crowd cheers rapturously.
It is only moments later when Kennedy steps back to the mic and makes a completely separate, self-deprecating joke, thanking his translator, that the crowd laughs.
The laughter was a shared moment of warmth regarding his accent, not a massive collective mockery of a pastry error.
So, the grammar is perfectly correct, the regional dialect for pastry is completely wrong, and the audio evidence proves the laughter was about a completely different joke. The myth is definitively, factually dead.
But to me, that realization opens the door to the most fascinating question of this entire deep dive. If this story is so easily disproven, how on earth did it become one of the most famous historical anecdotes in the world?
How do we trace the anatomy of this viral lie?
To understand the contagion, we have to look for patient zero. And what makes the spread of this myth so extraordinary is that it did not originate contemporaneously with the event.
There were no newspaper columns the next day mocking the president. There were no political cartoons featuring talking donuts in 1963. The myth lay completely dormant for 20 years.
2 entire decades pass before the jelly donut even enters the historical conversation. And when it finally does appear, it doesn't come from a declassified document or a historian's memoir.
It emerges in 1983 from the pages of a spy novel.
That is the astonishing truth. The genesis of the global myth can be traced back to a work of pure fiction, specifically a Cold War espionage thriller titled Berlin Game, written by the highly successful British author Len Deighton.
In the text of the novel, the protagonist, a cynical British intelligence officer named Bernard Sampson, is having a conversation, and he drops this specific dialogue. Ich bin ein Berliner, I said. It was a joke. A Berliner is a donut. The day after President Kennedy made his famous proclamation, Berlin cartoonists had a field day with talking donuts.
The author, Len Deighton, simply invents this amusing, cynical anecdote and puts it into the mouth of his character to add some weary flavor to the dialogue.
Any basic literary analysis will tell you that Bernard Sampson is a classic, unreliable narrator. You're not supposed to take his cynical quips as heavily researched historical fact.
Yet that is precisely the error that initiates the media contagion. The transition from a fictional character's quip to an accepted historical fact begins almost immediately upon the book's publication.
The catalyst was the book review section of the New York Times. In December 1983, a reviewer writing about Berlin Game decided to treat Bernard Sampson's fictional dialogue as an authentic historical anecdote.
The reviewer essentially stripped away the fictional context and presented the donut story to the Times readership as a quirky piece of real history.
And the reviewer didn't just repeat the claim, they actively embellished it to make it sound more plausible. They added the detail that the audience found the remark highly amusing, explicitly writing that Kennedy amused the city's populace because in the local parlance, a Berliner is a donut.
They took a completely fabricated premise, validated it with the institutional authority of the New York Times, and then retroactively invented the crowd's amusement to justify the story.
And once that anecdote was legitimized in print by the paper of record, the guardrails completely fell away.
By 1988, just 5 years later, the mutation of the lie was complete. It escalated from a passing mention in a book review to the central thesis of a full-blown New York Times op-ed.
The writer of the op-ed presented the event as an established historical blunder. They explicitly claimed that the president's highly paid speechwriters had made a catastrophic error, asserting that the citizens of Berlin reserved the term exclusively for a breakfast confection.
The writer even painted a vivid, completely fabricated picture of the crowd's reaction, stating that the residents pittered among themselves when Kennedy exclaimed, literally, "I is a jelly-filled donut."
Notice the incredible specificity of the phrase "tittered among themselves." It is a brilliant, evocative piece of writing that paints a crystal-clear image in the reader's mind of an event that literally never happened.
It is the perfect example of how adding granular, specific details to a false narrative makes it exponentially more believable. From that moment on, the myth bypassed all critical filters and exploded across the global English-speaking media landscape.
It became an unstoppable virus. The legendary British broadcaster Alistair Cook repeated the anecdote as absolute fact on his massively influential BBC radio program Letter from America.
It was published in The Guardian, it was broadcast on MSNBC and CNN, and it was printed in Time magazine.
The contagion even breached the walls of serious, peer-reviewed historical scholarship. Robert Dallek, an incredibly respected, authoritative historian, included the donut myth as an undisputed fact in his monumental 2003 biography of Kennedy, An Unfinished Life.
Dallek wrote that in the midst of the soaring rhetoric, no one was ready to complain that Kennedy should have said "Ich bin Berliner" instead of "Ein Berliner," which was colloquial German for a jelly donut.
When one of the premier historians of the era includes the myth in a definitive biography, it effectively becomes canonized as truth for the general public.
And once it was legitimized by historians and the media, pop culture cemented it into the collective consciousness permanently.
David Foster Wallace, one of the most brilliant literary minds of his generation, integrated the myth into his 1996 magnum opus Infinite Jest, writing that the German crowd greeted Kennedy's speech, quote, with a delight only apparently political.
The masterful satirist, Terry Pratchett, parodied the concept brilliantly in his Discworld novel, Monstrous Regiment. He creates a scenario where an invading commander attempts to express deep solidarity with a conquered nation, only to be politely informed by an aide that his translation was slightly off and he had just aggressively declared himself to be a cherry pancake.
And you can't talk about the pop culture impact without mentioning the comedian Eddie Izzard. In his legendary 1998 stand-up special Dressed to Kill, Izzard dedicated an entire hilarious routine to dissecting the absurdity of the moment, acting out the supposed confusion of the German crowd as they tried to figure out why the American president was comparing himself to a pastry.
The joke was everywhere. But here is the ultimate mind-bending punchline to this entire saga, while the entire English-speaking world spent decades laughing at this historical blooper.
The actual citizens of Germany had absolutely no idea what we were talking about.
It represents one of the most profound transatlantic cultural disconnects of the modern era. The jelly donut myth was practically non-existent within the borders of Germany.
And the reason is simple. As we established, the joke doesn't fundamentally work in the German language.
Yeah.
It is entirely a product of an English speaker fundamentally misunderstanding German grammar. Therefore, there was no reason for a German to ever invent or perpetuate the joke.
So you have this bizarre parallel universe situation. For 40 years, Americans and the British are constantly giggling about JFK's ridiculous pastry gaffe, while the Germans are earnestly, solemnly remembering one of the most beautiful, vital moments of Cold War solidarity in their nation's history.
You can see the stark divergence in the historical realities when you look at the media coverage surrounding the anniversaries and related events. Look at the year 2003, which marked the passing of Robert Lochner, the interpreter who had been so instrumental in helping Kennedy practice this speech.
When you read the obituaries published in the German press, they retold the story of the speech's creation with immense respect and historical accuracy. They didn't mention the jelly donut myth at all, simply because the German journalists writing the obituaries had never heard of it.
But if you crossed the Atlantic and picked up the New York Times obituary for Robert Lochner on that exact same day, the American paper prominently featured the jelly donut myth, stating it as an undisputed historical fact of his career.
Two allied nations living in two completely different historical realities regarding the exact same event.
The collision of those two realities didn't really occur until the widespread maturation of the internet in the mid-2000s. As digital platforms began enhancing cross-cultural exchange, Germans started interacting heavily on the English-speaking social web and suddenly realized, wait a minute, why do millions of Americans genuinely believe that John F. Kennedy called himself a baked good in our capital city?
The digital footprint of this collision is fascinating to track, particularly through the edit history of Wikipedia. The English Wikipedia page for the speech had users debating the jelly donut myth as early as 2001.
But the myth was entirely absent from the German Wikipedia article until May of 2005. And when it was finally introduced, it wasn't added as a historical fact. It was added specifically to explain the bizarre American misconception to confuse German readers.
The confusion grew so prevalent that by 2007, the editors of the German Wikipedia had to create an entirely separate, dedicated subsection titled Misconception in the English-Speaking World, simply to contain and address the relentless influx of the myth.
They practically had to issue a public service announcement saying, "Attention German citizens. Please be aware that the Americans have invented a highly specific, entirely fake story about our history."
Even the physical museums in Berlin were forced to adapt to the sheer volume of American ignorance. In 2003, the German Historical Museum hosted a massive exhibition detailing the history of the speech, and there was not a single mention of the myth anywhere in the curation.
But by 2008, the Kennedy's Museum in Berlin found themselves so overwhelmed by English-speaking tourists constantly asking to see the donut speech exhibit that the curators actually had to construct a brand new display explicitly dedicated to debunking the myth, just to stop the questions.
It is a profound demonstration of the resilience of an entertaining narrative over empirical truth. When a story is sufficiently amusing, the facts become almost irrelevant.
It is truly a wild ride. Let's synthesize the incredible journey we have taken today. We started by examining the brutally stark reality of a physically divided city. A city completely cut off from the democratic world, entirely surrounded by hostile forces, desperately waiting for a sign of American resolve in the face of Soviet aggression.
We observed an American president, deeply insecure about his linguistic abilities, painstakingly sounding out a handwritten phonetic cheat sheet to deliver an ad-libbed, highly provocative masterpiece of Cold War rhetoric.
A speech that terrified his own national security advisors and infuriated the Soviet leadership, but ultimately provided an immeasurable injection of hope to the besieged people of West Berlin.
And then we traced how 20 years later, a completely fabricated, cynical joke born in the pages of a British spy novel somehow breached the walls of fiction.
We watched it launder itself through the New York Times, infiltrate legitimate historical biographies, and hijack the legacy of that incredible moment, spreading relentlessly until the entire English-speaking world confidently believed a lie.
Which leaves us with a genuinely unsettling realization about the nature of our historical record. Consider how comfortable we are with historical bloopers. Why did the English-speaking world so eagerly embrace a fiction that undermined one of their own leaders' greatest triumphs?
That's a great question.
Perhaps it's because in the terrifying high-stakes era of the Cold War, where global nuclear annihilation was a daily threat, we desperately craved a moment of absurd human comedy, even if we had to invent it ourselves. How many other historical facts that we accept today are just well-traveled punchlines from a forgotten novel?
It makes you want to go back and forensically audit the footnotes of everything you think you know. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive journey through the geopolitical high-wire act, the linguistic intricacies, and the enduring pastry myths of divided Berlin. Keep questioning the fundamental stories you accept as fact, and we will catch you next time on The Deep Dive.